So today we are looking at Phobos from Spitfire Audio. This is the BT Phobos plugin. This is a recent production from Spitfire Audio, and what I've got on the screen is version 1.0.2, which was the latest release. Phobos is a whole new type of synthesizer. We're all used to the standard analog types, which have a DCO or some kind of modulation source, some kind of sound source, and then you apply filters to that, you apply envelopes to that, and various mangling techniques to produce multi-oscillator synthesis. And we're used to the latest things like convolution for our reverberation. And we all use convolution reverbs, I'm sure, in our orchestral arrangements for doing simulations of halls and rooms, etc. This is a very strange combination of the two. If you can imagine having four sound sources, so four oscillators essentially, but the sound sources are actually from samples, and then you put those four sound sources through up to 3 convolution effects, and the convolution effects, rather than being a reverberation tail, are another sample. So you're modulating or kind of changing a sample with the convolution, the waveform of another sample. So it's like nothing I've played with before. It's certainly a totally new experience and a journey. And thank goodness Spitfire Audio have given us hundreds of presets to play with to try and work out what the heck is going on with this quite incredible synthesizer. It's a totally new thing for Spitfire Audio. They've got their EDNA or their Edna engine as part of Native Instruments Contact, and they use that to mangle various samples from their classical orchestral libraries and some of the latest synthesizer libraries they've used. And of course, Spitfire Audio are famous for their very high resolution, high definition orchestral, both solo and ensemble patches. This is new. This is quite exciting. So that patch you just heard was one of the BT made patches called CS80's Last Words, and it uses 4 different sound sources put through 2 different convolution modulators. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go through hundreds of presets. If I wanted to do that, I could click on this little button here and I could go through a whole load of BT, Christian and Paul from Spitfire Audio's own personal favourites, Richard Devine, and of course Spitfire Audio as a company have put together some of their favourites from all of their team. I could just go through all of them, but what I'm going to do is go to the default state, which is essentially nothing loaded. So if I hit a note on the keyboard, you'll see the little grey keyboard down the bottom there move up and down, and you can see me hitting the keys, but there's no sound coming out because there's no sound sources. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a sound and show what this kind of synthesis can do. It's not for designing super tight, lovely kind of modulating leads, synth leads. It's not really designed for doing plucked instruments and kind of piano keyboardy type instruments. What it's really good for is doing these huge moving dynamic pads for these multi movement kind of percussive, what I call mandibles, lots of little moving sounds in the background. And the way you can do that is you can combine percussive elements with pad elements, with atmosphere elements, and create this this lush moving environment, which, as far as I can tell, seems to continuously change because of the way the convolution affects the sound. So I think to start with, we're going to load one sound source, have a play with that, see what we can do with it, and then affect it with a number of the convolution waveforms. So looking at the interface, we've got the top up here, and you can see it labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they are the sound sources. And by clicking on sound source, load source 1, load source 2, load source 3, and load source 4, you can select from this humongous menu of different sound sources. There are the BT loops, which are, as they describe, loops, and there are the BT tonal, which, as you can guess, are tonal sounds. And you can scroll through this huge list where you can just choose the name or the patch of a sound. You'll notice that on this list there are a whole load of sounds, all called funny names. And if you scroll down beyond the strange names, there are some waveforms. Go beyond, here we are, all the way down to 100 and something. There we are. There are some waveforms, and these are pitched waveforms. So you can see there's a D4, E3, G4, etc. And they are pitched waveforms. Then there's a whole load of analog waveforms, sines, squares, saws, and other mutated. And then there's a whole load more pitched waveforms. And then there's a whole load of sound effects and noises down the bottom as well. Most of which are named with strange names, and you just have to go through them and work out what they all do. Some of them are quite descriptive, others are just odd. You know, the dark arts, I'd expect this one up here to be something dark. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to choose the first one on the list. Makes life very easy for me. The first one on the list is called Angry Dragons. So double click on him, and now I've got the Angry Dragons patch loaded up here. On each of these sound sources, you've got a high-pass filter and controls for wet and dry. You've also got some interesting mappings to be able to control it using MIDI CC. By default, velocity and volume and panning is set up, but you can change these, and you've got 3 controls here, you see, but you can change these to anything you want. So I can change CC 10 to CC 11, for instance, and I can use that to control any of the envelope start, stops, positions, etc., which is quite fun. You've then got the parameters window, and you've got the wave window, and by clicking on these buttons, these will randomly, as it says here, select a wave or select a series of parameters. And you see every time I click on this, the numbers on the window are slightly changing, and every time I click on wave, it loads up a random wave. So let's go back to the wave I wanted, which was at the top, and choose Angry Dragons. The high-pass filter I'll leave where it is. The wet and dry controls refer to how much of this signal you send to the 1, 2, or 3, or in this case X, Y, and Z convolution effects. So I'm going to turn wet right off and leave it on maximum dry and play a few notes. You can hear that's panned all the way at the moment to the right. So I'm just going to play with that and bring it back. So let's use my expression pedal and just move that back into the center. There we go. So now that's in the center. And that's the loop called Angry Dragons. Using these controls, I've got a control of the full ADSR envelope, so I can change the attack. And there we are, nicely coming in. I can have a rapid attack, and I can have a instant off. Or I can change the release. So it slowly decays. I can reduce the sustain right down, so it fades out. And you can do all sorts of things. So it's a standard ADSR envelope which you can play with, which is quite nice to have. Sometimes it's nice to just use the start point, for instance, of a percussive loop and not use the rest of it. So there's a beat, Angry Dragons, and there we are. I can play it. Well, that's not very exciting. I want to do something with that. So if you think about how you affect these things, if you've got a percussive loop and you convolve it using a pad, if you imagine what you're doing is you're going to be kind of mushing up that loop and spreading it with mud. The pad will add a kind of muddiness to the loop. The other way round, of course, if you have a pad in your sound source and you convolve it using a percussive loop, what you'll do to the pad is make the pad sound a little bit more kind of staccato gated and a bit more percussive. So it's kind of a balance. You can do one or the other to either of your sounds. So for instance here in the convolver waveform, I'm going to try and load a tonal loop, not a percussive loop. So I'm going to turn off the BT loops here and just have BT tonal. And I'm going to choose a choir of BT1 and press go. The choir of BT1, for instance, is you see here the waveform, it looks like a kind of sustained patch. And now, if I press the key, I still hear the loop, but I'm not hearing the choir. The reason I'm not hearing the choir is the choir isn't actually a sound that's going to be produced. I need to send the loop to the choir using the wet dry controls. So if I send all the way wet and turn off the dry, now this Angry Dragons loop will be sent through this choir sample as a convolution. And let's see what that does. So can you see what it's done to the loop? It's muddied the loop with a kind of choiry sound. So if I now mix in some of the dry sound again of my Angry Dragons loop, we've now got the ability to bring in some of this muddiness of the choir with a loop, but also keep the loop running in the background. So for the moment, I'm going to leave those settings as they are, and I'm going to load a second sound source. My second sound source, I want to be a really high percussive loop. So I'm just going to do a search for high and see if it finds any hi-hats. So I'm going to choose high end. And I'm just going to try out what this high end sounds like. So for the moment, I'm going to mute by pressing the M button, the Angry Dragons. I'm also going to mute the convolver and just listen to the dry signal from this sample. Right, that's a bit in your face, so I'm going to put the high pass filter up quite high. There we go, and get rid of some of that bottom end. I like that, that's good. I'm going to unmute this loop and have a listen to them both together. Dial down some of that. That sounds quite cool. Now I'm going to turn back on the choir convolver. Now this is where this odd little triangle in the center comes into its own. You've got these four little triangles labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, conveniently, these correspond to the 1, 2, 3, and 4 for your source sounds. So at the moment you see 1 is hanging over here on the left hand side, and that implies that 1 is going to be affected mostly by W. This is where the W line, you can see it's joined up. If I move the 1 over here, it's going to be mostly affected by the Y, this bottom one, because it's mostly against this line. If I move the 1 up to the top, it's going to be mostly affected by the convolver, the IR loaded up into X. If you put 1 in the middle, of course, it's going to be affected by all 3, and you move it around in various places. And I want 1 to be affected only, in this case, by W. Well, it's quite easy because I'm not loading an X and a Y, so 1 is controlled by W. We've just loaded high end, so let's put number 2 over there as well, and have 2 also be controlled through the convolver of this W waveform, which is that choir waveform. Let's turn off the Angry Dragons and load some wet for the high end loop we just loaded and see how that sounds through our choir convolver. Turn off the dry signal. See, that sounds really nice. That's just a lovely washy sort of atmosphere. So what I'm going to do now is load another convolver. I'm going to load the X convolver. I quite liked that choir, so I'm going to go to the tonal. I'm going to choose the second choir, choir of BT2, and I'm going to send the high end over to this one. So by putting it up in this corner, it's going to send it to this one over here, and just see how that sounds. If I bring up the dry signal, I like that. So now let's bring up the Angry Dragon again, which we know is going through this convolver. Right, so that sounds really nice. It sounds a very washy sound, but what I actually want is I want some tonal sounds in there. At the moment it's a little bit atonal, it's a little bit washy, a little bit atmospheric. So I'm going to reduce the output of W and X so that they don't kill what I'm going to do next. And in source number 4 or 3, it doesn't really matter which one I do, I'm just going to load up a nice pad sound. I haven't had much time to play with this, so I don't know where all the pad sounds are. So I'm going to do a search for pad and just see what it comes up with. Okay, so we've got a whole load of pads here. And I think the AK2500 pad 1 is the best place to start. It's at the top of the list. So I'm going to load that one up. So what I'm going to do with the AK2500 pad 1 is turn off the wet control completely. So this is a purely dry sample, and just see what this sounds like. And let's turn off all these other ones first. See, that's too washy for me. There's too much tone in there. I want to make it a little bit more purer. So let's just see what else I can find if I do a search for pad. So let's have a look. I don't want any padded rhythms. I just want a tonal sound. I want nothing too complicated. Let's just go back through loop organ. Ah, there we go. What have we got here? We've got some kind of organ pad. Ah, there we go. That's a nice paddy sound. So let's turn that dry down. Let's increase the attack a little bit. Great. Now we've got a kind of a tonal pad. If I put the release along, a bit of a longer release there, and now bring in these other loops and bring in these two convoluters, I should now get a lovely combination of that pad with some of the more percussive convolved elements. By adjusting the output of the other two, you can bring the balance around. So that actually sounds really quite nice now. Let's just take those pads, and that pad I've just loaded, and give that a little bit of the IR, a little bit of convolver based on the third convolution. So let's just put 3 over there and load another convolution. I don't think it really matters what we load here. I'd rather have something that's a little bit rhythmical. So I'm going to choose BT loops, and I'm going to choose something that is complex just to annoy me, and choose voodoo percussion. And oh, you can see that's a very complicated loop there. So let's see what happens if we mute these other two and just have this pad going through whatever this strange voodoo percussion loop is. Turn down the dry signal. That's nice. So what it's doing is that fairly flat pad that we had before is now being mutated by this thing called voodoo percussion. I've no idea what this loop would sound like on its own, and in fact there's no way of finding out unless we load voodoo percussion, for instance, into a sound source and have a listen to it. But that's not the point. We've now got this pad which is really kind of moving. And it's got those lovely overtones. So I like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit more bass from that angry dragon, bring up those other two, get the dry wet ratio a little bit nicer, and then see what this sounds like as a pad with some percussion in the background. So now we've got a bit of a problem. We've got a loop a nice percussive loop that seems to be appearing on every key because that's the way it's set up at the moment. So now we've created a sound we actually quite like. What I want is my left hand, so from middle C downwards, to have big bass drones from our lovely pad, plus the loops playing, so I can stick with some nice kind of big bassy drones. But I want the right hand above middle C to only be playing that pad, so I can play some melodies on it. So this is brilliant. You could set this all up as multiple instances, or you can do it all within Phobos. So down the bottom of the screen here, you've got these odd little lines here, okay? So these odd little lines define where the various sounds will be affecting your sound, your audio. And you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, remember, at the top, and they are depicted by these first 4 lines, indicated on the right here by 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want 1 and 2, to be middle C and below. So I grab 1 and I take them to there. I grab 2 and I also take them to there. So 1 and 2 are only going to be playing below this. So let's just check that works. Let's try playing a note above middle C. And all we've got is our pad playing. Let's try a note below middle C. We've got our loop and our pad playing. So that's absolutely brilliant. So now what we can do is we can play a big, dark, meaningful loop down here. And then play chords at the top. Now, I don't know about you, but that's clipping my system, so I'm just going to turn some of these volumes down a little bit. There is no master volume on Phobos. If you notice here, there is no master volume. You have to control all the components separately. And that's actually quite nice because they are going to do odd things when you play with them individually. So let's just turn down that pad a little bit and just try that again. Absolutely lovely. I mean, it's just so easy to make something that just sounds big. It sounds very complicated. It sounds very big. All of our loops are tempo synced, which is absolutely cracking. So if you change the tempo in your DAW, in this case Cubase, the loops will automatically sync up. Most of the loops tend to be, as I've noticed here, in a standard 4/4 or 4/8 or a standard even number, which is a little bit frustrating. It'd be really nice to have some odd beats that you could bring in, maybe a couple of kind of 5-beat loops that kind of overreact and limp with others. But what you can do is you can build up these big fatty pad sounds, and I've linked the loops with a pad here, and I like that sound, but I could easily just click on any one of these loops, choose a tonal sound, and just, I don't know what these are, so I'm just going to click on them randomly for the moment. Let's get rid of that and put space. Now I've completely changed the form of the tones that are driving my convolution, but I'm leaving those 3 convolutions, the choir, the voodoo percussion, and the other choir the same. And if I just start playing things now, you'll see it sounds completely different. I'm just going to move this up so I've got a full keyboard's worth of pads, and then hit a note and see what happens. And it just builds up and makes it sound really nice. You can turn off the dry and just have everything wet if you want, and that should get rid of some of that overtone fuzz that we had there from the original samples. Let's decrease the attack on the 2 big pads and just have a play with that. Just play a couple of notes. Those pads are still hanging over, so I can change that now to another one. Again, I'm just going to choose a random one. There we are. Grand design, no idea what that is. And you can see you can just go bananas with this. So I absolutely love this. I'm going to have loads of fun playing with this. Big pad sounds, big moving kind of weird tones. There are some orchestral samples in here. If you hunt deep enough, you'll find some strings and some brass, which you can do all sorts of lovely things with and just pad out what you've got. There are also some really nice big deep sine waves. So just to finish off, that's how it works. You've got these mesmerizing little wiggly wobbly lines that show you what's being convolved. And of course, there's a spare sound source here we haven't used. Under the bonnet, as it were, there's pages of settings to look at the polyphony, which is a nice way of doing it. There's, of course, the about, which tells you all about it. There's a whole section of LFOs, which can be assigned to pretty much any parameter within the system. And then you've got the MPE mode, which you press and doesn't seem to do anything, but this means you can plug in your Rolly or your other MPE-enabled controller device and then use multi-channel audio. I happen to have a Rolly, and it's great just to be able to click the MPE mode and access the Rolly. You've also got a global gain control and a global pitch control, just in case some of your loops and your tones aren't quite in key, because that can happen. You are doing some odd things with audio here, and sometimes they just go out of tune. There's also a load of weird graphics all over the place, this funny crest and a whole lot of text and stuff. That's, to me, a little bit annoying. I'd rather get rid of that, but it's just there because Spitfire want you to be impressed with their graphic design. Of course, you've got mod, lever, and pitch control as well, which are fully assignable. So just to finish off, I go down to my factory presets. I'm just going to go to one of Paul Thompson's, choose the harmonic and melodic, and just choose sparkly horsey. No idea, but let's have a little play. Listen to the decay on that, absolutely lovely. Loads of weirdness going on there. And then, so that's a kind of a paddy sound you can get. There's lots of really nice kind of lush moving pads like that. So let's go to the Spitfire audio folder, go to one of the rhythmic patches, and let's just have a little look. Forest chase layers. Oh, nice and simple. Let's see what nice and simple is all about. There's some hi-hats, some kicks, some shakes, all going through some various bits and bobs. So let's just see what they do with this. Yep, that's simple. Nice little loop, brilliant. And let's go and do one more before we finish. Whispering Snakes. So what Spitfire have done here is they've created a weird and wonderful synthesizer using their sample technology and using BT's samples and a whole load of loops from the BT collection. You can choose amazing array of different sound sources and convolve them to your heart's content, or just load up sound sources and use them as individual samples. You don't have to convolve anything at all, but you've got the option if you want to and do some weird stuff. The Christian Henson, Paul Thompson, Richard Devine, and Spitfire audio presets are all very interesting. A lot of them are very clean, they're very crisp, they're very fun to play with. But if you know any music by BT, you'll know that the BT style is fairly in your face, fairly strange sounding. So just to load up one or two of his, this is the rhythmic section We've had Light Horses from our friend Paul Thompson. This is Dark Horses from BT. Lovely rhythms, really lovely rhythms. And let's just choose one of the BT harmonic and melodic pads, actually the hybrid melodic and rhythmic pads, and we'll choose Dark Places. A lot of his sounds are called Dark This and Dark That. Oh, actually, Ego Death sounds great. So let's do Ego Death and just see what this does. Most of the patches from BT and Spitfire use multiple zones like this, so once you've got a head around where you are in the zone, it's always worth starting just hitting the various keys and seeing what it has to offer, and you'll be quite surprised. So this is what this last patch, which is called Ego Death, has to offer. So there we are, BT Phobos, a bonkers synthesizer for the modern world. Really good fun to play with. Pads, rhythmical landscapes, atonal, tonal atmospheres. It does lots. As Spitfire will tell you, it's something like 12 billion combinations or something ridiculous like that that you can get out of it. So if you fancy a treat yourself to BT Phobos.